And so for the first roundtable discussion, the aim was to answer the question, how does climate change contribute to food and nutrition insecurity? And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over the floor to Laetitia van Eeckhout, who is a journalist at Le Monde newspaper, and she specializes in issues of food safety. And we're going to also leave time over for an exchange and discussion with the audience. And you could also tweet during the course of the discussions if you have any questions, which could be put to the panelists by Laetitia. So the hashtag is Hunger and Climate.
Bonjour. Donc effectivement avec cette
hi everybody. With this first roundtable discussion, we will try to explain in as concrete terms as possible, and we'll try and describe the impact of climate change on food security, food safety, and nutrition. So like Stéphanie Rivoal said, who today there are still 805 million people who suffer from hunger throughout the world. And according to the UN Development Program, it has predicted that there will be 600 million additional people by 2050 who will be suffering from food insecurity. It just so happens that I just spent a week in Burkina Faso, where I worked on a documentary with a team from Action Against Hunger, ACF. And so I really got a front seat and became fully aware of everything I've been trying to explain in my writings for a long time now. I was there. I got to see it live. Just a little anecdote. Just last Thursday, we were in Gombe, which is a province to the east called Lanyana. And there was a violent wind. They call it the red wind. It's a wind that sweeps up all the sand and the dust. And the entire town that we were went completely dark. It was only 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And the whole town became completely dark. And the animals went mad. They started running in circles. It swept up everything in its path, everything that was on the ground. And after about 45 minutes to an hour, the wind fell. And then we had heard that in a neighboring village close to Bugambe, there was a traditional chief who had just gained access to power. And to show his strength, the rumor was that he was the one that sent out the wind. And in these provinces, people really, they are aware of the link between the red winds and the drought that's progressively drying out their lands. And they're waiting for the rain. And that come, but are increasingly violent and also give rise to flooding. But they make the link between all these events and what's happening to them. The descriptions I heard when interviewing them, they managed to give perfect descriptions of the impact of these winds that do away with any ground cover, that totally decimate their crops and just completely destroy them when they're beginning to grow. They talk about the floods that lead to soil erosion. because the ground becomes waterlogged and saturated. They also speak about how the animals fall sick, how the children fall ill. They speak about divorces, exodus, husbands that abandon wife and child to go and seek a better life elsewhere. So for them, the links are very real between this climatic imbalance and the impact that it has on their daily lives. And in listening to them, in interviewing to them, we really get to understand the impact that these extreme events and the impact that climate change has on and how it affects food safety, whether it be relative to food production. It has an impact on access to food. When they lose their crops or they have a lower yield in terms of their harvest, this inevitably causes the prices to go up, and it puts a barrier up in relation to having access to certain markets. It also threatens access to certain resources. It has an impact on the quality of the resources, notably the water resources. Just last week, people were anxiously awaiting for the first rains to come. They were going through a period of drought. And so being there, this is where you got a first row view of the impact. Even if we all feel the effects of climate change throughout the world, it was really clear that it primarily affects those areas that are already very vulnerable. They are the first to suffer their impact in a very obvious way. These are the zones that are most vulnerable and that are the poorest. So in order to explain and give you more details relative to the phenomenon, we have 4 speakers with us here. We have Laurent Bopp, who is the research director at the CNRS, at the Office for Science, Climate and Environment. And he participated in the 5th report issued by the Eeckhout. We have with us as well Ibrahima Coulibaly, seated to my far right, who is vice president of the Network for Peasant Farmers and Producers in West Africa, the ROPPA.
Oumarou, Ibrahim.
We have Hindou, Oumarou, Ibrahim, who is a coordination of the Association of Poor Women and Indigenous People in Chad,
Isabelle,
the AFPAT. And then we have Isabelle
représentante de l'Unicef dans le Pacifique
who is a Unicef representative in the South Pacific area. I think her offices are located in Suva, which is the capital of the Fuji Islands. Now, what I suggest is we're going to split this roundtable into 2 parts. We're going to begin, so we're going to start off with the men, just relative to what they have to tell you here today. So Laurent Bopp and Ibrahima Coulibaly will set the scene a little bit in terms of explaining the reality. And then we have Hindou and Isabelle who will speak after, focusing on specific population groups, these being women and children.
Donc, je demande à Laurent tout de suite de prendre la parole.
Without further ado, Laurent, if you would like to
vous avez participé à la 5e
go up to the podium,
rapport
you
du GIEC.
participated in writing the fifth report in the intergovernmental group on climate change. This was a report that was published in November 2014, if my memory serves me correctly. And it highlighted that climate change and climate imbalance will have a very clear impact and effect on the entire food chain and food safety. Could you tell us what the highlights were from this report and the forecast for the 21st century? And could you tell us how this will impact food safety?
So, thank you very much for giving me the floor today. I will begin my speech, was going to be short, on some of the lessons which we learned from the latest report. So I'm going to remain very general in what I'm going to say, and by using some of the results that have emerged from the Ieckhout report. The Ieckhout made a report in three main parts about the physical changes of climate change and also the effects of climate change. And in the second part, and the second volume of the Ieckhout report, there is a chapter which talks about adapting to food security. And so it's in this chapter that I am going to draw the results of what I'm going to talk about now. There are still a lot of gaps in this chapter, as you're going to see afterwards, because the Ieckhout, to be able to write this report, has to rely on existing literature. We haven't got any scientific results, latest results in the Ieckhout report. In particular, in the tropical countries, and the agriculture we have very few reports about the Ieckhout was able to rely on that. I'm going to come back at the end of my intervention to be able to talk more about that, what we might look forward to in the outlook for the future. I want to make three main points. We want to talk about detections, what we see about climate change on food insecurity, and the second point on the projections for the future, and then I want to come back to the role of extreme elements in the weather. As we see, there are a lot of gaps in that still. And so the effects of climate change on food production are already being felt. And this is what Ieckhout, by relying on about 60 studies that talked about the yield of the great variety in the farming yield. And we see that it really varies according with the climate change and also with the change in temperatures. And so what the scientists have shown over the past 30 years, the wheat and corn yield in our areas has been reduced by 5 to 10% because of a rise in temperatures. And that's a fairly interesting figure that has come out of the study. It might be positive in certain areas, but in most cases, the impacts are negative on almost all types of agriculture that we have studied. And we talk about agriculture in the Ieckhout chapter, but there also is a part about the Asian areas. And this is going to be a part of the theme of food security. And the Ieckhout relied on the 30% of the stocks which are overexploited, with 60% of other stocks which are underexploited. And so the stocks are practically being exploited to the maximum. Now, according to the scientists that emerges from the report, with climate change, we can show the displacement of certain species toward the north. We've seen this in the Northwest Atlantic, for example, and we're also in Australia. We see that because of climate change, crops are moving further north. Now, concerning the crops, and the aquatic resources, and the climate change is underway, and we can document that at least. And the second part about the projection of the climate change, the Ieckhout has also relied on the reports that we have at hand, and we talk about the climate, temperature, and rain, and based on models that helps be able to represent the crops that we're able to study. Beyond 3 degrees Celsius, because in maize, it's going to have an impact on all the crops, wheat, corn, rice, but also other kinds of crops. Now, among the impacts on the climate change, you have the role of temperature. It's going to play on these kinds of crops. But also, it also shows the change in rain in certain areas. But I'd also like to remind you here the role of increasing of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is one of the main reasons for climate change. But in certain cases, it almost might fertilize certain kinds of species. The system is complicated, the rising temperatures and the change in the rainfall and other impacts like the CO2. And so if I come back very quickly about CO2, it can fertilize in certain areas. But at the same time, what the scientists have shown, this can also reduce the nutritional quality of what is produced by reducing the proportions of proteins or minerals. Once again, if we look just at the total quantity of the food produced or the quality, we can arrive at results which are fairly contrasting. Now, if we come back to the projections, on a scale by the end of the century, as we saw in the introduction, the scientists are saying that there's 70% of the kinds of crops are going to be largely affected by that, with a drop in yield by at least 50% in most cases, with a bigger impact in the lower altitudes and in tropical countries, with a potential for positive results in more northern latitude countries. But when we include this on the global level, however, there's still going to be a reduction in the overall food production. There are also contrasting impacts between the tropical oceans, which are going to be affected negatively by climate change with a drop in productivity, and in certain more northern areas, because of the heating of the climate, there could be a migration of certain species and even more stocks in the northern hemisphere country, more toward the north. And my final point, I want to come back to certain gaps in the report, in this fifth report by the GASCA. We didn't really deal very much about the production with the scientific data that have emerged from it, with the scientific articles concerning the recent crises. To try and learn with the climate extremes that have impacted on that, but we have very few data about what concerning production and also in the yield. And perhaps another major gap is the way that the climate variability affects food security. From a climate point of view, it's already complicated enough. But the GIEC says, but the science say that, but with the climate change, we can expect greater climate extremes and more heat waves and more droughts. And these events are going to play a very important role in the food production and in the food stocks. Two kinds of events that we've talked about, which this year, which are seeming to be very important in Western Pacific, with the big repercussion on the fisheries. Once again, a lot of scientific doubts about it, because it is a natural phenomenon, but we're unable today to say if climate change is going to lead to an increase in these activities and in the frequency of these activities, but it's very difficult to link climate change and, in certain cases, food security. And so if I come back now to the tropical cyclones that we've experienced, the data has shown that we can expect there's going to be an intensification of the cyclones. And in certain cases, we have the results that show that with the climate change, and the link to extreme climate events like cyclones and food insecurity. So I'm going to draw a conclusion here by reminding you that there are a lot of gaps in scientific terms, but we have shown, and we saw this, and it figures in the latest GIEC report. Thank you very much. And so we are going to have a chance, in fact, to come back on that a little bit later. So now I'd like to call Ibrahim and Coulibaly, if you wouldn't mind going to the podium.
vous êtes donc non seulement vice-président.
You are not just vice president of the ROPPA, but also you are a member of the VIA Campesina, the Farmers Association in Mali, and you are also an ambassador, a special ambassador in 2014 during the International Year of Family Farming. So by putting the accent on the year of the family farming, it's important. Family farming is a figure that we sometimes tend to forget. A statistic we tend to forget that is the small farmholders supply 80% of the food supply in the world, and they meet 80% of the food needs in the world, and they produce 80% of it in the world. And moreover, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and in Southeast Asia, and in these countries, this represents, and this 75 to 80% of the people in these countries live from farming. And so it is the essential role that is played by family farming, by the peasants, by the farmers. So Ibrahima, this issue of adaptation to climate change, isn't it all the more important for these small farmers, these family farmers, who don't have the same means as the major industries to be able to face, to confront the climate change. And yet, if we are following a farming model which is more respectful, if I may say thus, with the northern model, for the planet, would there be any advantage? So good morning to you all. I'd like to come back to what everybody knows concerning climate change and the impact it has on the farming sector in general, but to try to show you through an illustration what I have experienced and what I'm still experiencing. This issue of climate change is lived on a daily basis. In 1973, I was 7 years old, and I was in primary school. And in our Sahel region was hit by the worst drought that we'd ever seen in history. And I remember at the time that we had a cold season, which began in November and ended in February, which enabled us, after the rainy season, and this helped grow certain kinds of resistant grass, and we're able to reinforce its resistance during the 7 months of drought that would follow. Now, during this cold season, it really was very cold. I remember very well. But it doesn't exist any longer. We used to wear sheep hides in the cold season, but we no longer need the wool because this cold season doesn't exist anymore. In 1973, indeed, we experienced this worst drought, and it lasted for several years, right up into the 1980s. And we continued having a repeat of this drought, which didn't enable us to grow sorghum and to be able to finish the cycle. We had to cut down the grass that, in fact, it was too soon. And this helped create food insecurity problems that our region was devastated, in fact, by the changing weather conditions. And the cattle no longer had anything to eat either. But we were still, people organized to be able to fight this situation. And we adapted to the situation. So we changed our practices, we changed the varieties that we cultivated, and so we changed more resistant, more active species. And we began by fertilizing the soil more with ash and with feces from the animals, and that helped the region continue to survive, despite the severe drought, which in fact is still continuing today. And the crops can no longer work all year round, but we have very complicated seasons, and during the rainy season, which lasts on average 3 months, or sometimes 4 months, it can sometimes end a little bit later. And so we have a very short farming period. We have to be able to raise the crops for the whole year. But it's extreme, and this is very important when we have flooding. But floods can increase the danger of the situation because it destroys the soil, it destroys the trees, and we continue to experience that today. And so climate change is no longer a question. It is an absolute certainty. It's our living. It's what we live on a daily basis, and we have to accept this on a yearly basis as well. And in fact, we are not even able to raise enough grain to be able to give even 1 sack to our chickens, and that is what we are experiencing. We have to make decisions on a daily basis, which are vitally important. I said we have a classified forest, which is a very important reserve for food for our animals. But in fact, this forest has been privatized as a part of this program in deforestation. And we have a very rich company, in fact, which bans any committees to enter into the forest nowadays, and we are no longer allowed to send our animals into the forest. And so this makes more vulnerable the community as well, and we haven't got enough crops to be able to feed the animals as well. So what do we do if we can't send them into the woods? But there's no policy that goes along with this. I don't even think that our political decision makers are even aware of it. They are aware of the seriousness of the situation, because there's no consultation between them. When you have journalists, for example, and they go to local committees and they talk about how do we live on a daily basis, how do we live in the chaos of each season, and we have to try to find sustainable solutions. And so people are living in the situations of vulnerability, and the fields are no longer producing what they're supposed to. They can't feed our animals. And when the flooding comes, it devastates the soil, it erodes the soil. And so this issue of climate change, we can still hope that our studies are going to be able to arrive at results, but I think we have to have a plan B for our social elements. But I think the revolution has to go from down to up. But we can no longer count on politicians to do it for us.
Justement, mais peut-être qu'on va prendre un micro. Comme on en a deux, je vous laisse en fonction. J'ai peut-être vous relancer justement. Faire poursuivre un petit peu sur ces questions.
Well, just to carry on with this issue, this question.
Comment finalement permettre on a le sentiment que finalement dans les négociations sur le changement climatique,
we get the impression that when it comes to the negotiations on climate change, having experience of local communities and seeing their daily reality, seeing the reality of this family small farming is being overlooked. We get the impression that it's not present in the consideration. So how do you think that this can be taken into account in a better way? How can these realities be better taken into account in the framework of these negotiations?
Je pense que de toute façon, la société civile fait
déjà
tout ce qu'elle peut.
I think that civil society is already doing everything that can. There are initiatives, there are lobbying campaigns, There's a lot being done in civil society, and there's a lot being said about climate change and the impact on local communities, and a lot is being said about the risks. It has to be said. People are continuing to say, yes, in 50 years' time, when our islands disappear, we're going to have climate refugees. But climate refugees already exist. Where I live, all the youth around me, they want to leave. They want to go to Spain. And their boats sinking every day in the Mediterranean, and yet it's not dissuading the others from leaving because there's not much for them back home. They are wondering about their future, and they know that if they remain in that situation, that there's no future for them. That's why they want to flee from the Sahel. If you look at the whole Sahel band, it's destabilized by weapons trafficking, arms, drug trafficking, which has possibly got nothing to do with religion. All of this is happening because the region itself has become unlivable. The politicians have totally overlooked this region, and they say, okay, we're supposedly helping the different cities and countries, but they're helping the corrupt politicians. So that's not where the solution is. So us as peasant organizations, as social movements, we're busy developing alternatives. But with the few resources that we have, we are creating schools to train the small farmers so that they can understand techniques they can use, which will give them better results. How can they react to flooding? How can they do market gardening or other types of activities during heavy rain? So they are concrete solutions that need to be reinforced, and the politicians overlook all of that altogether. On the contrary, they see these small-holding farmers as marginals that spend their time criticizing government action. And so I think that the movements need to train the communities to have better results, and there needs to be more of an exchange of data in Latin America and other continents, the agroecological practices that are being developed. And we need to develop that back home so that these communities can better adapt and continue to produce enough food for them to eat. And so you say these movements are beginning to develop. There's different exchanges between the different smallholding farming communities and different movements throughout the world. So, Laurent, Bopp, scientific reports are becoming more alarming and clearer on the issue. And maybe this word is a little bit strong, but how do you explain this lack of action on behalf of the politicians? That's what we refer to as an inertia. How can we convince them to initiate strong action in order to progress relative to these issues? What's your analysis? Well, I'd like to give my answer in 2 parts. The first part is linked to uncertainty. And the way that scientists talk about uncertainty. Climate change is, of course, a complicated issue. Even if we can be sure of certain things, there's a lot that remains uncertain. When it comes to the action that undertaken by man and climate change and its impact on food safety, there's a lot of uncertainty. Where will we be in 30 years' time, in 50 years' time? Scientists are using the tools that they have available today, but there still remains a lot of unknown factors. But the impacts are already happening, though. It's going to get worse in the future. Well, what I'm trying to tell you is that there are a lot of things that we're not actually capable of forecasting for now. Extreme events, what's going to happen with water. There's a lot of uncertainties around all of that. And I think that the decision being taken by politicians when faced with the uncertainty is very difficult. So it's not because things are uncertain that we must make decisions. On the contrary, you need to be able to take decisions even when you're faced with uncertainty, because there's just too many uncertainties out there. A second point is related to natural climate variation. So there are climatic trends that are man-made, but there's also natural climatic variations that have always existed. And so it's very difficult to link a specific event to the climate change happening in the tropical regions. It's very difficult to say that specific year. What happened there was because of man. And so we need to be able to establish the link between what's naturally variable, the extremes, and climatic variations. And because this also takes time, political action needs to take place now. If we say to the politicians, what are you going to be doing about reducing greenhouse gas emissions? The results based on that decision will only be seen in the next 20 years' time. So the decisions they're making today, you will only feel the effects in the next 20 to 30 years' time. So that's what makes it so difficult. All right. I don't think we should. Thank you very much. I think we have to stick to our time constraints. So now I'd like to call upon the ladies to intervene. And by looking at what's happening to women and children, we'll get a better idea of the situation too. So I'd like to call upon Hindou, who is going to give us a presentation. Would you like to remain seated, or would you like to go up to the podium? If you don't mind, if you could go up to the podium.
Oui, on n'a pas parlé des populations pastorales, mais
so we haven't spoken about the pastoral populations, but they've also been hard hit by climate change.
J'allais dire les petits agriculteurs.
As hard hit as the smallholding farmers.
Donc, il faut le chercher, ou le
resources are becoming increasingly rare. They need to look harder for them. And certain populations have settled to grow their own crops. Water resources are also becoming increasingly rare.
Et effectivement, sur le terrain, on se rend compte combien finalement ça touche tout le monde.
Out in the field, we realize that everybody is actually affected. The question is, what has the impact been on the women in these types of situations? So from your concrete experience, could you explain what's happening to the women in these regions? So thank you, Laetitia. So, hi everybody, thank you very much to the organizers for having organized and integrated this topic, which is quite a marginal topic when it comes to talking about climate change. But via
qui sont marginalisés dans d'autres. Je commence à dire quand on parle de l'agriculture,
by saying that we speak about agriculture, and this is the breeding of animals, fishing, etc. But scientifically, people prefer to talk about crops and harvests rather than speaking about other means of subsistence, such as animal breeding. And so that's something that tends to be overlooked and becomes marginal. When it comes to animal breeding, and that is a main activity of the community that I come. It's a nomadic community.
De ces modes de vie, on en dépend de l'environnement.
And so we depend on our environment. We're always in search of water and the field for pasture. And I'm going to tell you, this is just a picture to give an idea, but I'll tell you about my own experience. So people have to move to look for pastures and for water to feed their animals. And so we feed the animals, and because the animals are also a source of food. And the woman's role in this type of lifestyle is something that takes place behind the curtains. Traditionally speaking, the women look after the children, they look after the men. And so they provide food for the entire community. It's the women that milk the cow and can use the resources in the cooking, but they also go out into the bush to look for leaves to add to the food within the household. So if they feed the household, that means the community is fed. The men are the ones that take the cattle so that the cattle can go feed out in the pastures. So now you can see that women work on food security and have an impact on the human beings. But it's a role that's not really recognized, and it doesn't really get attributed a lot of value within the community. whether it be within the community, nationally or internationally. And so this has an impact on all of humanity. We just heard 80% of food is provided by rural communities. So if you look at what's happening in the Sahel region and the economy, there are problems, but 40% of it is constituted from animal breeding. And within political spheres, both regional and national, this is considered a marginal issue, even though it constitutes a large part of food supply. The role of women also generate revenue and make ends meet. So they are the ones that are the link between the different markets. It's the woman that collects all the food from the different sources of production. And she is also in touch with the community, with the other communities, the fishing communities, and they all live together and are complementary with each other.
La sécurité
So
alimentaire,
the woman
sur l'alimentation,
is the link when it comes to food safety, food security.
D'alliance se créent à travers le
And
femme.
this is where
les impacts du changement
all links
climatique
and communal ties are created by the woman.
Changer tout ça
Now, when it comes to climate change, this has changed everything.
Il vient de parler des inondations et de la sécheresse. Alors maintenant, on fait face à des saisons au lieu d'avoir 3 saisons comme il l'a dit. Les saisons sèches beaucoup plus longues, les saisons de pluie beaucoup plus courtes, mais qui se déterminent soit par une sécheresse beaucoup sèche, comme on est dans le Sahel, et tout de suite, on se retrouve avec des pluies qui arrivent beaucoup plus fortes et qui créent des inondations. Et du coup, pour les pâturages, soit ils pourrissent quand il y a beaucoup d'inondations, et là, on est obligé de se
affects the
déplacer beaucoup
pasture
plus loin.
lands, and
Et si
meaning
c'est la
that we have to
sécheresse,
move around
ces
a lot more.
pâturages, ils deviennent secs.
And
Et là,
during the
il y a
drought,
plus
the
d'eau
pastures become
qui
a lot
restait
drier
3
because
à
there's
4
no
mois.
water.
Maintenant, ça
Whereas
reste
before we used to have
moins
3 to 4 months
dû à
supply of water,
l'évaporation de l'eau. Et
due
là,
to
les
the
communautés
evaporation
sont
of the water,
obligées
it lasts a
de
lot
transimer beaucoup
less
plus
time.
loin
And so the
pour,
communities have to move
retrouver l'eau
a
et les
lot more and a lot
pâturages.
further
Et l'impact
to find
se
sources of
répand
water
sur les
and
femmes parce
pasture
qu'elles vont
lands.
faire les
And
liens
this has an
avec les
impact on
marchés
the
les
woman
plus
because it's
proches,
the woman
tandis que les marchés se
who
retrouvent beaucoup plus loin.
goes to
Et là,
the
elles
market,
n'arrivent pas
and the markets are being
à aller
found
vendre
further
leurs
and further
produits.
away,
Il
and
n'y a
it's
pas
being
un système de
increasingly difficult
conservation
for
de
women
ces
to go and
produits
sell their
pour qu'ils
products.
restent vraiment
There's
bien.
no system to keep the woman home and comfortable.
Et les deux bouts ne sont pas
Very
réglés.
often,
Et tout de suite, on voit
the
l'impact
food
sur
will
les
go
enfants,
off,
sur les femmes
and
qui sont
then they can't make ends meet. And
nourries.
we see
Et
the
les
impact,
hommes
especially when we look at the
exotent
women and
pour
the
dire, bon, on va
children
ramener
who are
peut-être,
malnourished.
quelques aliments pour compléter, mais du coup,
And so we
tous
need
les
to bring in
travaux
other
restent vraiment
foods
sur les
to make up for
femmes.
what's
Et
missing,
là, c'est
but there's a lot
déplacement
of pressure being
de
put on the
plus
woman.
transhumance crée des
And so
conflits intercommunautaires
the
dont
fact
les
that we have to
cultivateurs
move a
et
lot
les
more and a lot
éleveurs.
further is
Et
creating
ces conflits se
intercommunity
répercutent vraiment maintenant dans le
conflicts.
Sahel et ça
And
crée en plus
this type of conflict that we increasingly see in the
une
Sahel
pression
region
sur l'environnement et
is
sur les
putting
ressources
more pressure on the
naturelles qui se
environment
finissent
and on the
par des
natural resources,
sévères,
because at the end of the day,
des sévères malnutrition au niveau des personnes
it also gives
adultes
rise
et
to
au niveau
severe
des
malnutrition, not only in
enfants
children,
dans
but
toutes les
adults as well, throughout all the different communities. So I'll stop there for now. Okay.
Sur tout ça. Enfin, Isabelle Austin. Donc, je crois que ça fait 4 ans que vous
So Isabelle Austin,
êtes représentante de l'Unicef
you have been a Unicef representative for the last 4 years in the South Pacific region.
Clairsemées d'îles et qui sont effectivement, j'allais dire, à la fois menacées par l'élévation.
A region which is being increasingly threatened by rising water levels,
fréquemment, manifestement,
as well as
touchées par des événements extrêmes.
affected by other extreme incidents.
Il y a encore à peine 2 mois,
it was just 2 months ago.
Le cyclone Pam.
The region was hit by Cyclone Pam.
22 îles
it hit 22 islands or something like that. It swept over. I'm going to tell you all about it. You're going to tell us all about it. Okay, great.
Alors, vous êtes quand même d'UNICEF, donc.
Now you represent UNICEF in the region, and so you focus mostly on children.
Et à travers votre témoignage, est-ce qu'effectivement,
Now,
vous expliquer
through your witness account, could you
ces événements
tell us and explain to us the type of consequences that this type of incidents had on children. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for having given me the opportunity to participate in your conference on the verge of the upcoming negotiations on climate.
Donc, notre bureau de l'Unicef
in a few months' time.
est situé dans le Pacifique
Now,
Sud.
our office is located in the South Pacific, but it covers 14 little countries as well as territories.
Les pays avec lesquels nous travaillons représentent en fait 10 voix aux Nations Unies.
Have 10 votes at UN level. And so these are particularly important when it comes to the current negotiations that are underway and that are in the pipeline. So I will be focusing today's presentation on our experience
dans les îles du Pacifique.
In the South Pacific
Donc, il y a un peu
Islands.
plus d'un mois, nous avons eu le
So
cyclone
about a month
tropical
ago,
Faim. Nous avons
we
des
were hit
cyclones
by
tous les ans.
Cyclone Peul. We
pas
have cyclones every year.
une nouvelle extraordinaire,
So
simplement ce qui est
it's
très
nothing
important,
extremely new for us.
c'est que ce
But what was
cyclone
important here is that this
est un
particular
cyclone de
cyclone
catégorie 5
was a Category
et
5
c'était le plus gros
cyclone.
cyclone depuis au
And so
moins
it
50
was
ans.
one of the
Il a
biggest
touché
cyclones
à
that
des
hit the
degrés
region
divers,
in
les États
the last
de
50 years.
Kiribati,
So
les
it
îles
affected
Solomon,
Kiribati, the Solomon
le
Islands,
Vanuatu, le pays qui s'appelle Tuvalu, et
a
dans une
country
moindre
called
mesure
Tuvalu,
également la Nouvelle-Calédonie que vous connaissez
and
peut-être,
New
ainsi
Caledonia,
que
which
la
you're probably more
Nouvelle-Zélande.
familiar with, as well as New
Le
Zealand.
cyclone Pam est considéré donc
Cyclone
au Vanuatu comme la catastrophe
in
naturelle la plus
Vanuatu
dévastatrice de
was,
toute l'histoire de l'archipel.
the most devastating
Nous avons bien entendu Laurent Bopp
disaster
tout à l'heure.
of the entire history of the archipelago in Vanuatu. As you heard earlier, we heard that scientifically we can now establish the tie between climatic change and the increase
des catastrophes naturelles.
of natural
Nous n'avons pas eu
disasters.
que le cyclone Pam.
But we
Dans
weren't
le
only
nord du
hit by Cyclone
Pacifique,
Pam.
un
In
mois
the
après,
North
nous avons eu
Pacific,
deux
just a
autres
month
événements
later, there were
climatiques
two
extrêmement
other
importants.
climate
Le cyclone
incidents
Messac en
that
particulier,
occurred.
qui a
There
ravagé
was
la Micronésie,
the Mesa
et
cyclone
une
that
partie des îles
ravaged
Marshall
Micronesia
également. Ça, c'est dans le
and
nord
part of the
du
Marshall
Pacifique.
Islands. So this is in
En
the
tout
North
cas,
Pacific
pour le
region.
Vanuatu, c'est
In any
plus de
event, as regards
50% de la
Vanuatu, there
population
were
qui a
over
été
50%
affectée.
of the population that
Évidemment,
were
en termes
affected
de
by
nombre de gens
Cyclone
affectés dans
Pam.
le Pacifique,
In
nous
terms of
parlons toujours de
the
petites
numbers of
populations.
people, we
Mais
always
pour
speak
nous,
about small populations, but for us in the region, 50% of a single population being affected, so that affected 82,000 children, was an extremely serious event which required international
Et
aid.
d'ailleurs, au moment où le cyclone Pam
On a large scale.
ravageait le Pacifique,
And as Cyclone Pam swept the Pacific, there was a third conference being held on reducing risk of disasters in Sendai. And the Prime Minister of Vanuatu was in Sendai at the time. And so he acted as spokesperson, not only for his country that had been hit, but for all the Pacific states, and bearing the message to the UN Secretary General as well as the rest of the international community. Now, as regards our topic here today, Cyclone Pam damaged 90% of the subsistence crops, including fruit trees, coconut trees. We saw the coconut trees, which is quite rare. We saw them lying flat down. Generally, palm trees tend to tip, but they are very resistant, and in this case, they didn't resist. In the most affected islands of Vanuatu, as well as the Kiribati and Solomon Islands and Tuvalu, in some of the Solomon Islands, the entire plant coverage was completely destroyed, and the population had to be evacuated from the islands in a wait of
Dans tous les cas, des dizaines de milliers de familles ont dû recevoir de l'aide alimentaire en espérant un redémarrage de leur production
food aid in the hope that they could get their crops up and running again in the next few months. As we already had, 80% of Vanuatu's population depends on crop farming for their food supply, which meant that the children were very hard hit in a disproportionate way. We estimated that at least 50% of children under 5 years of age in Vanuatu following these events were put at further risk of illness, disease, and
les pays du Pacifique,
malnourishment.
autrefois connus comme paradisiaques, font désormais donc la une des journaux pour d'autres raisons.
Paradise Islands, and now they were making the headlines for another reason. So this is the island of Kiribati who adopted measures and got involved in negotiations with the Fiji government in order to gain access to a certain number of deals and in order to be able to evacuate a part of their population.
Les conséquences du changement climatique sont déjà un défi maintenant quotidien pour les petits pays
climate change now have created daily challenges for these small insular countries. And as you know, there are 4 countries that are part of the 10 countries that are most exposed to natural disasters. And this is something that is becoming more commonplace.
Beaucoup de pays du Pacifique se situent à moins de 5 mètres au-dessus
du
niveau de la mer. Donc, ce que vous voyez en rouge maintenant, ce sont les pays qui sont à moins, dont la majorité de la Terre est à moins de 5 mètres du niveau de la mer. Lors du cyclone Faim, les vents violents ont créé des vagues très importantes. Nous avons eu donc des vagues de plus de 4 mètres de haut qui ont touché Kiribati. À Kiribati, le point le plus haut dans un seul point de l'île capitale de Terre est à 3 mètres du niveau de la mer et nous avons eu donc des vagues de plus de 4 mètres de haut. Donc vous imaginez facilement l'état de destruction
the amount of destruction
et de traumatisme que
the trauma that was suffered by the children and their families.
À Tuvalu, toute la population est à risque de ce genre de phénomène. Si vous voulez une sorte de comparaison, à peu près 2%, juste un peu plus de 2% de la population de France est exposée à des phénomènes côtiers d'érosion et
these type of coastal phenomena such as erosion and flooding. Only 2%.
Nous avons là une petite vidéo, je crois, qui va vous montrer en images
a little video clip which will show you
a couple of je ne sais pas si la régie va pouvoir l'envoyer.
What happened there. I'm not quite sure if we can get the video going.
En tout cas, voilà.
Climate change is a really big issue for us, the young people and children of Kiribati. And we always ask ourselves, what is the future for us, as a people?
We are the front of the front line, and we want the world to listen to what is happening to us.
Our islands are really very low and narrow. But it's not only frightening storms. We've had no rain for many months, and the drinking water in a lot of our wells has become salty. You can't drink it. Most of our food and protein comes from the reef, but the rising temperatures have begun to destroy them. As young people who will be leaders of tomorrow, we're not just sitting around doing nothing. We're trying to do something about this issue.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup. Donc, des dizaines de milliers de familles ont perdu leur accès à l'eau, soit parce que les puits ont été contaminés, vous avez vu un petit puits sur une des îles, soit ils ont été contaminés par l'eau de mer, soit par les débris, soit parce que les installations de collecte d'eau de pluie, c'est-à-dire les toits, ont été détruits. Il faut savoir que les petits pays insulaires du Pacifique, et particulièrement les atolls, font face à des problèmes d'eau
the atoll islands are facing water shortages,
leur approvisionnement dépend de bulles qui flottent au-dessus de l'eau salée. Ces ressources sont donc extrêmement fragiles et très sensibles aux sécheresses, ainsi qu'à la salinisation due à la montée du niveau de la mer ou aux grandes marées. Donc les conséquences dont nous sommes déjà témoins menacent de s'aggraver en raison de la destruction des récoltes causée par les sécheresses, les inondations et les tempêtes à répétition, ce qui évidemment accroît la malnutrition et l'incidence des maladies et évidemment compromet l'accès à l'eau potable. Cette situation de fait contribue également au déplacement des populations et à l'accélération des flux migratoires. Nous l'a rappelé. Nous avons également pas mal de migrations dans le Pacifique. Donc pour assurer la sécurité de l'accès à l'eau tout en faisant face à ces défis environnementaux, requiert que les pays utilisent toutes les ressources possibles. Les eaux de surface, les eaux souterraines, les eaux de pluie, et parfois la désalinisation.
as well as desalination
il y a
techniques.
peu d'alternatives, en fait, pour l'approvisionnement en eau potable dans les
many alternatives when it comes to gaining access to drinking water in the Pacific Islands. There are a lot of isolated communities that are not covered by state services,
en fait, pour gérer
and they have to organize themselves
de manière
and
durable
to plan
leurs propres ressources en eau,
organize their own water resources in a sustainable way, as well as their sanitation facilities and hygiene. I'm nearly done.
Les organisations, les décideurs, les experts internationaux,
the decision makers, international experts and organizations have a lot to learn if they look to the strategies implemented by these communities, but they also need to support the local initiatives that have been undertaken when it comes to providing for food safety and access to drinking water.
Le nombre d'enfants frappés par les catastrophes du
the number
climat
of children that
augmente
have been
de façon
affected by
exponentielle.
climatic
Environ 66 millions d'enfants
is
sont
rising on an
affectés chaque
exponential
année par les
level.
catastrophes naturelles.
Millions of children are
Dans les 10
affected every year
prochaines
by natural
années, nous
disasters, and
estimons que
over the next
175 millions
decade,
d'enfants
we
par an
estimate that
pourraient être
175
touchés par
million
les
children
catastrophes dues au
will be
climat,
affected
ce
by
qui se
disasters
traduira
linked
notamment
to
par
climate,
l'augmentation de la
which
malnutrition, de la
will
prévalence de diarrhée
lead
et
to
d'autres maladies
greater
graves.
diarrhea, more malnutrition, and other serious
Il est donc
diseases for these children.
indispensable que les investissements dans le développement ainsi
that
que les
there be
réponses
further
aux situations
investments
soient informés
in
par des
development,
actions
as well as
visant la
responses to
résistance
emergency
aux catastrophes naturelles et
situations,
au changement climatique.
that actions be
Pour les
undertaken.
enfants, 3 domaines sont
There are
prioritaires.
3
L'accès
fields
à
that
l'eau
should be a
potable,
priority for children:
un
access to drinking
environnement
water,
sain et protecteur,
a
y compris
healthy
en
and
cas
protective
d'évacuation
environment,
temporaire,
including
et la préparation
during
des écoles
temporary
aux
evacuation,
urgences.
and
Nous
schools
devons
should
également
be prepared
soutenir
for
les systèmes
emergency
et de banques
actions.
de
We also
données
need to
modernes mises à jour sur la
support
disponibilité d'accès à l'eau et à
systems where
afin d'améliorer la planification et la
databanks
prise de décision
in order
pour les actions de développement et la
to help
préparation aux
planning
urgences.
and decisions made in terms of preparing for
Récolter
emergency
l'eau de
actions.
pluie est une réponse simple qui permet aux
The
familles
collection
d'améliorer
of
leur accès à l'eau
rainwater
et à
is a
l'hygiène.
simple alternative
Trouver des
which gives
solutions
families
innovantes pour
access to drinking
l'assainissement
water
familial
and
permet de
hygiene.
protéger les
Finding
ressources
simple
en eau
solutions
et
will
de réduire les maladies.
help families to protect
Rendre les installations plus résistantes
water
aux aléas
solutions and resist
climatiques est un
diseases.
impératif qui a d'ailleurs été pris en compte tout particulièrement lors de notre
resistant to
réponse
climatic change is something that was taken
situations
into
d'urgence causées par le
account
cyclone Peul.
in our
Finalement,
emergency
prendre
solution
en
to
compte
Cyclone
les
Peul.
besoins des
We
enfants
also
dans
need
le
to take
cadre
into
des
account the needs
investissements
of
sur
children
l'adaptation
when it
et
comes
les
to
énergies
investing in
renouvelables
adaptation
aura des
and
effets
renewable
vertueux sur toute
energies,
la société.
and this will have positive
Sécurité
effects for the
alimentaire,
entire
mortalité infantile
society
réduite,
in terms
amélioration
of
du développement des jeunes
lower
enfants,
mortality rates,
amélioration de
improving
la santé maternelle et
development of
meilleure
children
qualité
and
d'éducation.
maternal health, as well as
Je vous
providing for better
remercie de
education.
votre
So I'd
attention.
like to thank you very much for your attention.
Merci. Justement, vous me disiez qu'effectivement,
So, as you said,
pourrait faire pour
what we might do to limit food and malnutrition insecurity will have an immediate impact for childhood and for children. But how can we plan? How can we prevent? How can we forfend against the risk which threaten us? What do you think we can do in concrete terms to meet these hazards? There are several dimensions. There's a global one, an international one. As I have mentioned, both in the Caribbean and the Pacific, they have a very big voice in the United Nations on discussions on climate, but not only. They also have a lot to say about the finalization of the growing of the concerns for sustainable development in the world as well. And so, at the heart of our preoccupations for that, in relation to sustainable development, also the protection of islands from oceans. That is one dimension. The second dimension is to remember and to respect the fact, as Mr. Coulibaly and the other speakers have reminded us, the fact that the people of the Pacific live on their islands and every year have to face adverse events. Therefore, they have developed a certain number of responses, which we call resilience. And that is a fact that they live with. And so we have to build this on this capacity of recovering after the events, adverse events, and to support initiatives that they undertake. And to be able to do that, there is a certain number of investment in infrastructure, for example, to make schools more resistant to the climatic conditions, and to ensure that the roofing is built in such a way that it can continue to collect the rainwater, but also to consult a little bit more, and I think Mr. Coulibaly highlighted this for another part of the world, but to listen attentively the proposals made by the people, and especially the young people. If we want the young people to have a future in their own countries, we have to be able to give them the occasion to be able to build it, rather than climbing in boats, which often lead them to death, and in the Pacific, it takes them to retention centers, which is not perhaps the most propitious solution for the future. But there are quite a few techniques for having fresh water, and things are developed in the Pacific. And this idea of migrations, is it very considerable in the area? It is manifested in two different ways. All the nations are archipelagos, and the people who live on the remote islands have a tendency to repatriate toward the capital islands or the bigger islands, to where the state departments and services are present and they can benefit from it. But they cost an awful lot of money, in fact, for these small countries to be able to ensure public services in all the islands. And it also leads to a lot of hardship for the country itself, having to leave their homelands, their small remote islands. And that is the one phenomenon. The second phenomenon is, as you are experiencing in Africa, in certain parts of the Sahel, this kind of hopelessness, this lack of future, which means that anybody with an education is going to move into the Pacific. They go to Australia or New Zealand. Perhaps you have heard the fact that Australia's policies are not necessarily very welcoming. And so after that, there is a third migratory phenomenon between the countries, between the atolls, which are the most under threat, and the countries like Fiji or Vanuatu. These are volcanic countries where you have also natural disaster dangers. And this has already existed, but in fact things are accelerating, it seems. Now, among the discussions and international discussions, I'm not saying that everything is taken into account, but the phenomenon of what is going on in the southern Pacific Islands, and we talk about them. On the other hand, in material terms, as you stressed earlier, Hindou, the big role played by women to feed the community, it's something which often is not included in the discussions that we have. What can we do to improve the listening or hearing the voices of the women in the community? And this is an important question, it seems to me, to put on the table. And it's a crucial question. These issues and questions, we have to look at them on our level, on our cultural level. If we talk about the place occupied by women, what place does she occupy? Even if we talk of Europe, women have fought for years, and in Africa, what place do they occupy? Can we continue to give them quotas to say that we have a certain number of percentage of women who are going to be ministers or included in a project? Or do we have to, in fact, sit down in a meeting room like this to be able to see and to hear these women who have something to say, to really try and decide on what the place is? We're not here to fight for the place, but concerning nutrition, it's a matter of survival. And I don't think a man is going to eat for 10 days. He's obviously going to be hungry, and so he has to be taken care of. And we live the same thing. We drink the same water. We eat the same food. And so we're not going to say 30% for women or 50% for women. We're not going to set quotas. But it seems to me that the place for women should be in their action. As we heard in the intervention earlier, between 50 or 80% of the population are going hungry. And so if these 80% of the population are going to be affected by it, they're going to go seek food where it is. But I don't think we have to wait for situations like this. In present negotiations and discussions, I think we have to make a proposal to try to help people. But how are we going to put them in material terms in the text? How are we going to give the proper place to these women in the accords and agreements which we're talking about now? And how many women there are to defend the place of the women in our society, in the field, in the projects? And how do we write that down? But I think there's a place for women. I think we have to talk in depth so that there is an acceptance that they are made aware of what's going on, and they make people aware of what's going on. We have to really be in the heart of things, and we have to be a major actor in this, and for that we have to be listened to. Everybody has to give us our place and give us our proper value, and to take into consideration these are the solutions proposed by the women which are sustainable. But in anecdotes, they say they are the best managers because they manage their households, for example. And so give us a place to be able to manage more than just our households, but the decisions, the major decisions. If everybody is convinced that it's going to be done by women, this is going to be important. Why keep them? Why marginalize them? Why keep them excluded from these kinds of processes? The place for the women, we have to give them this so that they are listened to.
J'allais dire, dans toutes ces interventions, il y a...
Now, in what you've all said, there's kind of a common theme. Is there kind of a reassuring theme that we can find, draw from all this? On the fact that the communities and peoples are not waiting that from above, that the politicians are going to decide to do something in a strong manner, but in the field they build their own strategies to be able to face the climate change, what is going on, what they have to experience every day, and which are on the increase.
Alors maintenant, reste à ce qu'effectivement, justement, ce qui se développe sur le terrain.
What is occurring, what is developing in the field, it has to come up from the field so that it be taken into consideration. But is there anything reassuring that we could draw from what you've said this morning? Perhaps we would like to ask now the room to, if you have any questions, to want to ask any of the panelists. Don't hesitate.
Oui, alors juste une petite annonce.
Just an announcement. I'm here in the back of the room. We are going to start with two tweets, and there are two questions from the room from the lower room, and a question from the upper room. And so questions from Twitter, Aurélie from Châtelet, who would like to ask Coulibaly, how is no African government has requested for food security in the text that they are discussing? And the second question from Marie Portuil, qui is addressed to Laurent Bopp, who asked for details about the change of climate change on the volatility of food prices. So shall we group together? So you want to have all the questions? So the following questions?
Est-ce que y a là?
Bonjour. Bader, référent agriculture durable ACF.
At ACF, my question is toward Mr. Coulibaly, keeping in mind that you are the representative here of the ROPPA, which of West African organizations of the farmers, small farmers. I'd like to know at what level and at what level are the current negotiations concerning Africa, especially Western Africa, in relation to the preparing the COP21? Are you consulted at all on a regional basis? Or even just in Mali, are you being consulted, given the fact that you're also the president of the producers organization in Mali? Are you being consulted and involved in the discussions that are underway concerning Africa in relation to the COP21?
Bonjour, je suis
Good morning. Ibrahim Bamako from an association, an NGO, which defends the environment in Cameroon. And my question, I'm really not sure whom I'm addressing this to, Monsieur Ibrahima. This is kind of for everybody. And what I heard earlier in one of your speeches is that the civil society in Africa is already undertaking material actions to be able to adapt to climate change. And that really troubled me when I heard that. And then our journalist friend said that how can we do so that the actions undertaken by civil society and the various themes they are proposing at present are going to be acted upon for insertion in our considerations on climate change. It seems to me that's the real question. If we start from the idea that civil society is involved in Africa, that are already mobilizing and are offering alternative solutions, which up till present have a difficult time being adopted by the national politics, certainly because the various politicians that we have upstream are more or less corrupted, to speak frankly, because quite simply the false solutions proposed by them under the encouragement by certain public donors have demonstrated their limits, and they're continuing to show their limits. So my question is how, in the present negotiations, how can we guarantee the participation of civil society if we start with the principle that in any way that it is a civil society which is showing the right way? As African civil societies, we encounter to participate in this negotiation process on climate change. It's the Geyser barrier. That's a real problem. We in Africa, we have the impression that it's a strategy which are set up to prevent us of participating in these negotiations, because to date our role as observers is to mobilize us with our governments in such a way as to say, here's what we think, while they are around the table, negotiating table. And that is my concern. How can we guarantee that our participation by civil society in all of the conferences and the agreements we're talking about, like the visa barrier, in fact, that I talked about. So any final question up there in the room?
Madame.
Thank you very much. Mine is not just a question, just a short comment about the Laurent Bopp information, agricultural activity, how impacted greenhouse gas emissions, and you said that there are some countries or some regions will be kind of beneficial on that. The last few years, the new scientific reports really showed us that this is really false consciousness. There's no such thing. Some North countries will be helpful. In the long time, everyone will be extremely negatively impacted. So it is better always to say that, because there is some kind of ease on that. Some countries will be much more beneficial on that. Thank you.
On va juste prendre une dernière question.
Just one final question.
Claude Tombou, je m'adresse à Ibrahim.
Claude Tombou, I'm addressing Ibrahim. I'd like to know, outside of the Mali civil society here, the government has not implemented the strategies that we've been talking about on a national level to fight against climate change. And if the strategy does exist, could you give us a couple of the pillars of this strategy? Please give us an idea of what it consists of. No microphone. Elle parle pas dans le micro.
Hello.
Voilà.
Doreen Stabinsky from College of the Atlantic in the United States. And my question is a follow-up really on the Special Rapporteur's comment. And it's a question to Laurent. In the negotiations, we talk about a 2-degree limit, and many developing countries talk about a 1.5-degree limit. But the policies that we're following are policies and measures which are taking us to 3 or 4 or 6 degrees. And I gather that you're an author of the adaptation to working group 2 report, and I wondered if you could give us just a little bit more. Maybe tell us what the differences are between a 1.5 degree, 2 degree, 4 degrees on agriculture. Because as I look at the literature, I can't even imagine what 3 degrees or 4 degrees of warming looks like on the African continent in terms of food security. And I wonder if you could give us a little bit more detail about whether we can even manage 3 degrees or 4 degrees. What does that look like in Africa? And how do we get there from here?
And so I'll let Laurent try to explain these differences between the various degrees that we have to worry about and the other questions which have been asked us.
Oui, je vais revenir sur 3 points. D'abord sur la partie.
There are 3 points. First, on the comment about the effects.
Même dans le dernier rapport de l'IPCC,
even in the latest IPCC report, we have these confirmations based on certain scientific knowledge. We have to be very precise here, because the message carried by these confirmations could have political implications. In the IPCC report, the Eeckhout, which mentioned that with climate change, certain documents mention increases in certain areas of surface areas that can be cultivated. And that is a potential benefit. And now, on a higher scenario, over 3 degrees, all agriculture in all the regions is going to be negatively affected in every region. In the chapter on food security, and this comes back a little to that, the different scenarios are a little bit mixed. We talk about 2080, and some people are getting, with a high scenario, by 3-4% degrees, is going to be negative, probably everywhere. And other scenarios, by 2080 or 2050, we're talking a lower scenario, which is in degrees. And so we're going to continue working on that to be able to distinguish between the benefits and the negative aspects in the 4 scenarios with a lot of studies that are going to be involved. And so I note this point, and you're right to say that we have to be able to talk about that discuss between the various scenarios, between what a world's going to look like with 2, 3, 4 degrees more. And once again, in the Group 2 report on adaptation, and this is also true for the food security chapter as well, the different scenarios are often mixed, and with more than 1 degree or 5 degrees is not at all the same world. I work on the ocean and the climate change effect on the fisheries of the world, and it's very different between a world of 2 degrees or 4 or 5 degrees. It's very different. In the ocean, a temperature of 4 degrees is where the scene itself is going to be very much modified. All the ecosystems are going to be profoundly affected by it. It's also going to increase the acidity of the water. It's going to increase at just 4 degrees. In a world of 2 degrees, we can limit the increase in temperatures, and also are able to limit the acidification of the oceans, as we're doing in the coral reefs. And it's completely different between 2 and 4 degrees. And one final point about a world at 2 degrees. But limiting the warming to 2 degrees on an industrial level, we're practically, by limiting the global warming to just 1 degree, it involves a lot of limitations on the greenhouse gas effects, stabilize the climatic effects, and the reheating to under 2 degrees. We have to reduce the CO2 by 40 to 50% by 2050. It means reducing, not stabilizing. And at over 2 degrees, we have no emissions or in the negative, and that's what the world will look like tomorrow. And so we're going to have to reduce the quantity of CO2 in the atmosphere. And the emissions, where we're going to continue talking about that, this is 4 or 5 degrees, is not going to resemble what we are going to be able to make projections for 2 to 3 degrees. I'm not at all specialized about the volatility of prices on food prices due to climate change. What the Iecc report says, and here we rely on scientific documents, we have the impression that the volatility is much greater as a response to climatic events. With the greater they are, the more volatile the prices come, and this may have to do also with the impact of other effects like the limitation of exports, which is going to make prices go up. But there's also a lot of uncertainty about the volatility of prices and the volatility of the weather. But the extreme weather situations, we are starting to have solid knowledge, in fact, what the impact has, but that is something that still remains to be demonstrated.
So I won't mention any figures because I don't want to make a mistake, but I just want to tell you that Oxfam carried out a study about 1.5 to 2 years ago, and they specifically addressed the impact that all this change, that climate change would have, and what the consequences would be on prices. And so they said that the volatility will increase when it comes to prices.
Ibrahim,
Ibrahim, you were asked a question from the room.
Effectivement, sur les négociations, sur savoir effectivement pourquoi.
When it comes to negotiations,
pourquoi est-ce que les États finalement africains ont demandé et pourquoi ils ne l'ont pas demandé.
The question is, why haven't the African states asked for food safety to be included and to have a prominent position in the texts that are being negotiated? Is there any coordination at a regional level? Or even at an African level? So could you shed a little bit of light on all of that? Well, thank you.
La question du fait que les États africains n'aient pas demandé la sécurité alimentaire,
that it wasn't a request by African states to include food safety. You have to look at their state of mind in terms of their approach to the climate negotiations. So if you really look at what's going through their mind, you don't... Africa goes to these negotiations to get money. They're not really in search of the real solutions that are going to settle climate problems in Africa. They already start off on a losing foot in terms of these negotiations. And for me, it's a real disaster that they come just to get money from the richer countries. The second reason is that if you look at what's happening in relative to food imports in Africa, Africa is not incapable of feeding itself. Most of the governments are getting their financing by importing rice, sugar, and other major consumer food products. So that's how they're getting their financing. That's how the political parties are getting their financing. And that's why we can't achieve food sovereignty, because it's not really their priority. If they really had to invest in food production, they would be undermining the financing to their political parties. That's the sad reality. I think if you look at most countries, when there's a change of president or a change of political regime, you have a new rice importer that comes to the fore, and that's almost automatic. So that's not, I just think it's really not their priority. They come to the negotiations because they're looking for money. So that's my answer to the first question. Now, when it comes to coordination, it's starting slowly but surely. Recently, I received a message where they're trying to put together a meeting in Bamako by the end of June. I think it's because they want us as ROPPA to consult with us. So there is a process that's starting in terms of coordination. So we'll come to the table with our positioning as peasant farmers, with our priorities, and we want to achieve food sovereignty for our region and promote family farming. This is all inscribed already in public policy. And so that's what my friend from Cameroon was saying. There's a lot of inconsistencies, and that's what always catches up with us in Africa. If you look at the agricultural policy, it recognizes food sovereignty. This is the ultimate aim. It recognizes the central role played by small producers and family farms. But the government on this end is just doing its own thing, and so it's very difficult to implement the policy because all the governments are doing everything except that which is inscribed in the regional policy. So if Europe had done the same thing with their common agricultural policy, we would have famine in Europe. That's the problem. We have inconsistencies. Getting people together and creating something that's consistent, coherent, that's the biggest problem that we have today in Africa. Because even if you have an excellent policy which has really been well designed with all the stakeholders involved, the implementation and execution of that's where we come across a problem. And I think as long as we haven't found a problem to resolving these inconsistencies, we have a problem. I think we need to take a step out of the box from time to time. Being involved doesn't mean listening to everything everybody has to tell you. Because in Libya, for example, they say, yes, civil society is there, the peasant farming societies are there, but if you go to a meeting, okay, there's no execution behind it. I think sometimes you have to voice the fact that you're not on board, rather than being used as an alibi, as an excuse, and nothing happening behind that. What was the other solution? The RED mechanism. I'd like to give you two examples that I'm really familiar with. In Mali. A few years ago, there was a Dutch national that married a Mali national, and with the government, they were very close to the power in force, and they put together a project for agro-foods. It was... And there were two companies that were created. There was a type of, two organizations. There was a kind of an NGO that was managing the funds that were being received, and then a private company to manage the production and the sale of the product, which is called Yatrafa. And so it was the farmers that were taking all the risk by the private company, and him and his political friends were handling all the financing, all the subsidies. So you can only imagine, which meant that there was the mechanism. And I live on the border of this classified forest that's just been handed over to a political financial conglomerate who is actually receiving funding. They have planes that fly above the forest every day to make sure that we don't send our animals into the forest. They have police officers who are financers with these resources. But the villagers living around the forest have never been consulted. They never tried to discuss things with us. They never tried to understand our issues. They were just there and they wanted the money. They have actual planes. They have 4x4 vehicles. They have private police that are guarding the forest. But we can't send our animals into pasture, and we can't cut the wood in that forest. And that's what's happening in the field. The communities are never involved, and when money is to be spent, it never gets sent where it's needed. There are other examples throughout the world where the money is used. There was the mangrove plants, and there was 2 euros a day. And is that development? Is that how you're going to help people to combat poverty? So I think if you want a project to be useful, you need the peasant farming organizations to come up with their own project and to get their own funding. They do work of really good quality when it comes to ecology. But the carbon resources are being taken away from them. So why not? We have agricultural training schools, but nobody's investing in those because that's the last of the politicians' worries. I think that's the type of things that we need to be funding. But once again, the mechanisms are only serving to make the elite that much richer and aren't really settling the problems of the communities that are in dire need. Thank you very much. I'd just like to hand over the mic to Hindou, because I saw him react when Ibrahim was describing the Africans' state of mind and their approach to negotiations. When he said that they're there primarily to get hold of money. Well, thank you very much.
Pourquoi les Africains n'époquent pas la question de la sécurité alimentaire?
The reason why Africans aren't behind the issue of food security, you've got to just ask yourself how many topics, how many subjects are involved in international climate negotiations every day. And I think how many people participate in the negotiations? The convention takes 2 people, 2 representatives per country, which are countries that are already poor, that already have other priorities. They have to feed the population, they have security. And how many meetings do they have to participate every year? And they only pay 2 people to participate. And it's not the COP where the real negotiations are taking place, because that only takes place once a year. There are negotiations, technical negotiations between them. But the powerful countries like France, like the US, how many people actually attend the negotiations? There's experts in health, in agriculture, and they're discussing all topics. And so there are a wide number of discussions where innovations are being discussed. We spoke about RED, we spoke about RED+. The Africans need to already understand what the RED concept is. And by the time they've understood what RED is, they've already gone to RED+. And by the time they've understood what RED+ is, they've gone on to green economy. And by the time they've understood what RED, they've gone on to mitigation. So these 2 people, where is their role? There's a whole economy behind that, and I think that the intention is really to exclude the poorer countries, because so they can just carry on producing countries. They say, yes, the Sahel region is impacted by food safety issues, but how many years have we been speaking about food safety? There are organizations that are taking rice from our countries, and our countries are supposed to be starving. Now, if you take a step out of this, And you say that hunger, there are going to be 600 million people that are going to be further affected by hunger. Are we moving forward or are we moving backward? It's a political game. The Africans need to have their space. They need to be able to really participate in the negotiations. They need to be given the time to really understand all the topics and propose their own solutions. They need to be made a priority. Food security is not something that's supported by African countries, not because it's not a priority for them. Because otherwise, not because they don't want to implement the program back home, but they don't have the time to understand. We don't have experts in all the different fields. We don't have people attending and participating in all the different negotiations that bring the questions back home. And so the questions related to agriculture are left to the northern countries that come up with what we spoke about being artificial solutions, false solutions. They are land grabs and agrofuels, and this is not necessarily what you want. So if the agricultural experts and the peasant farming experts, if they could be the one involved in the negotiations and take the real questions to the negotiations, that's where we can find the real solutions. But the northern countries aren't going to like that because it's going to break their economic models and their import models in terms of goods being transported from African countries. That's what bothers me when it comes to these negotiations.